What if I told you that a man, guilty, condemned, and unworthy of forgiveness, found something in his final moments that most of us spend a lifetime searching for? You might think that once a man is sentenced to death, his story is over, that justice is served, and that's the end. But what if it wasn't? This is the story of Darius Holloway, a man who had every reason to hate himself, every reason to believe he was beyond redemption. A murderer, a lost soul, waiting for the electric chair to take what was left of him. But what happened in those final hours? What were his last words? And why did a grieving mother, the woman who had every right to despise him, sit and listen? Because this isn't just about justice. It's about something deeper, something most people never expect to find in a place like death row. By the end of this video, you might just question everything you thought you knew about guilt, redemption, and the power of one final choice. Stay with me, because this is a story you won't forget. The air in Ravenhill was thick, heavy, the kind that clung to your skin like an unwanted memory. The sun hung low in the sky, burning everything beneath it, turning the cracked sidewalks into shimmering rivers of heat. The sound of cicadas filled the air, their endless buzzing blending with the distant hum of passing cars. It was the kind of heat that made you feel trapped, like you were suffocating even with the sky stretched wide above you. On the porch of a weathered wooden house in Hillcrest, one of Ravenhill's forgotten neighborhoods, Darius Holloway sat in silence. The porch creaked under his weight as he leaned forward, forearms resting on his knees, fingers interlocked. He was a man built for labor, broad shoulders, strong hands, muscles hardened by years of carrying burdens no one else wanted to bear. But his eyes were tired. Not the kind of tired that sleep could fix. The kind that came from years of running from choices, from guilt, from himself. Across from him, perched on a rickety old chair, sat his mother, Martha Holloway. She was a woman whose face had been carved by time, lined with the sorrow of a life that had never been kind. Her dark brown skin, once smooth, was now marked with the wear of raising a son in a world that had no mercy for men like him. Her hair, once thick and black, had given way to gray strands that framed a face that had forgotten how to smile. Between them, the silence was a living thing, a heavy, suffocating presence that neither dared to break. The radio beside Martha crackled, its signal weak, the voices distorted but still clear enough to deliver the news. Another shooting in Jefferson Boulevard, another life lost, another mother left to mourn. Darius exhaled, long and slow. "You hear that?" Martha finally spoke, her voice low, worn out. Darius didn't respond. He just nodded, staring at the ground. He already knew what she was going to say. "Ain't nothing changed," she continued, her fingers tightening around the armrest of her chair. "Same streets, same blood spilled, same boys thinking they bigger than the weight they carry." Her eyes found his. "Ain't much different from when you was out there, is it?" Darius's jaw clenched. He didn't need the reminder. The past was already sitting with him, whispering in his ear, clawing at his chest. Martha sighed, shaking her head. "I seen that look before." "What look?" His voice was hoarse, almost a whisper. "That weight on your shoulders." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Ain't no man supposed to carry that kind of weight alone." Darius let out a humorless chuckle, wiping the sweat from his brow. "Ain't got much choice, do I?" Martha didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her faded blue dress and pulled out a crumpled pack of cigarettes. She hadn't smoked in years, but tonight felt like a night to start again. She took one out, lit it, and inhaled deeply, her gaze never leaving her son. "You ever stop to wonder, Darius?" she asked after a long pause, smoke curling from her lips. "What life would have been if things had gone different?" Darius's chest tightened. "Ain't no point wondering about things you can't change." Martha exhaled, the lines around her mouth deepening. "Maybe, but that don't mean you don't think about it." Silence again. The cicadas screamed. The night grew darker. Darius finally looked up at her, his mother, the woman who had spent her whole life fighting for him, protecting him, believing in him, even when the world didn't. And what had he done in return? Brought shame to her doorstep, given her nothing but grief. He swallowed hard. "I ain't that boy no more." Martha studied him for a moment before nodding slowly. "No, you ain't." Her eyes, filled with something unreadable, flickered toward the road. "But I wonder, Darius, what kind of man are you now?" Her words landed heavy, like a stone sinking into deep water. Darius didn't answer. He didn't know the answer. In the distance, a siren wailed, breaking the silence, echoing through the streets of Ravenhill. The night had swallowed Ravenhill, turning the city into a graveyard of neon lights and restless ghosts. The air, still thick with the heat of the day, carried the distant echoes of sirens and the occasional burst of laughter from drunks stumbling out of bars. The kind of night where secrets moved in silence, where choices felt inevitable. Darius Holloway walked with his hands deep in his pockets, his broad shoulders slightly hunched, his steps slow but deliberate. The streets of Hillcrest were nearly empty, just as they always were at this hour, just stray cats, flickering streetlights, and the hum of a city that never really slept. He knew where he was going, and he knew what it meant. Earl Mackenzie had called earlier that evening, said he had something lined up, something quick and easy. But nothing was ever quick and easy with Earl. That man carried trouble in his veins, like most carried blood. Darius should have ignored the call, let it go like he had for the past few months. But money was running thin, and desperation had a way of making old mistakes look like solutions. He turned the corner onto Jefferson Boulevard, where the city bled into something uglier. Abandoned buildings, chain-link fences, and windows covered in old newspapers. And there, in the dim glow of a flickering street lamp, Earl was waiting. Earl had always been a wiry man, but prison had carved him down even more, left him with sharp edges and a face that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. His arms were covered in faded tattoos, inked stories of violence and bad decisions. He leaned against a rusted dumpster, cigarette hanging loosely from his lips, watching Darius approach with that familiar smirk. "Knew you'd come," Earl said, his voice rough, the kind that sounded like it had been dragged across gravel. Darius stopped a few feet away, keeping his hands in his pockets. "Didn't say I was in." Earl let out a low chuckle, flicking his cigarette to the ground and crushing it under his boot. "You wouldn't be here if you weren't." Darius exhaled slowly, glancing up at the sky. There were no stars tonight, just a thick, suffocating darkness. Earl reached into his jacket, pulled out a revolver, and tossed it toward Darius. It landed in his hands with a weight that felt heavier than steel. "Got a job," Earl said, his eyes locked on Darius, measuring him. "A little store off Lincoln. Guy running the place is a kid, barely old enough to shave. Ain't got no security, no cameras, easy money." Darius turned the gun over in his hands. The metal was cold, lifeless. He hated the way it felt, hated how familiar it was. "Thought you said you were done with this," Darius muttered, gripping the handle tighter than he needed to. Earl scoffed, stepping closer. "Ain't nobody ever done with this, D. Not when the world got its foot on your neck." He tilted his head, studying Darius. "You got a better way to put food on the table? 'Cause last I heard you barely scraping by." The words cut deeper than they should have. Darius clenched his jaw, looking past Earl down the empty street. He didn't want this. He didn't want any of it. But the truth was, Earl wasn't wrong. Work had dried up, money had run low, and bills didn't care about promises to stay clean. Earl took a step closer, voice lowering. "Ain't no one getting hurt, man. We in, we out, just enough to keep you on your feet. Hell, I'll even take the heat if something goes sideways." Darius let out a slow breath, rolling his shoulders like he could shake the weight off. He knew how this story ended. He had seen it play out too many times, had lived it himself. But standing there, in the quiet darkness, feeling the weight of reality pressing down on him, he could almost convince himself that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. Maybe this time, there really wouldn't be any blood. Maybe this time, he could walk away clean. He closed his eyes for just a second, just long enough to pretend he had a choice. Then he slid the gun into his waistband and nodded. Earl grinned, slapping him on the back. "Knew you'd come around." The night stretched on, shadows shifting along the pavement. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. And just like that, fate had been sealed. The streets of Ravenhill were quiet at this hour, too quiet. The kind of quiet that made a man's thoughts louder than they should be. The neon glow of a liquor store sign buzzed in the distance, the only sign of life in the dead of night. Darius Holloway sat in the passenger seat of Earl Mackenzie's rusted-out sedan, parked 2 blocks from their target. The windows were rolled down, letting in the thick night air, damp with the distant scent of rain that hadn't yet fallen. His fingers drummed restlessly against his knee. "You sure about this?" Darius asked, his voice lower than he intended. Earl, hands gripping the wheel, let out a laugh, sharp, humorless. "Ain't about being sure, D, it's about getting it done." He turned, his eyes gleaming under the dim streetlight. "You start thinking too much, you start messing up." Darius nodded but didn't say anything. His gut twisted in a way he didn't like. He had done things before, things he wasn't proud of. But this felt different. Earl checked his watch. 2:35, he muttered. "Store closes in 10. We get in, get out, no mess." Darius exhaled and wiped the sweat from his palms against his jeans. He didn't like how his body already knew this wasn't going to be easy. Then Earl opened his door. Darius followed, stepping onto the cracked pavement. The Lincoln Avenue convenience store stood ahead, its glass front reflecting the dim streetlights. Inside, behind the counter, a young man stood, leaning on the register. He looked barely out of high school, just a kid. Something inside Darius tensed. Earl pulled his hoodie up, rolling his shoulders like a fighter before a match. He glanced at Darius. "Let's go." They stepped forward, their shadows stretching long across the parking lot. The door swung open with a chime, the scent of stale coffee and cleaning supplies hitting them instantly. The kid behind the counter straightened. His name tag read Sam. "Evenin'," he greeted, his voice casual, unaware of the storm about to hit. Earl didn't answer. He moved fast, yanking the gun from his waistband and pointing it straight at Sam. "Register, now." The shift was instant. Sam's face drained of color, his hands shooting up. "Oh, okay, man. Just take it easy." Darius felt his heart slam against his ribs. It wasn't supposed to be like this. The kid was too young, too scared. Earl's patience was thin. He slammed a fist on the counter. "I said open it!" Sam fumbled, hands trembling as he punched in the code. The register beeped, and the drawer slid open with a soft click. A few crumpled bills and some coins. Earl cursed. "This it? You gotta be kidding me." "It's all we got, man," Sam stammered, his chest rising and falling too fast. Darius could see it happening before it did, the way Sam's eyes flicked to the side, towards something under the counter. A panic button. "Earl," Darius warned, but it was too late. The alarm blared. Everything exploded into chaos. Earl snapped, jumping the counter, grabbing Sam by the collar. "You think you're slick?" Sam struggled. "Please, Darius moved on instinct. "Let him go, man, we need to." And then, bang! The gunshot cracked through the air like a lightning strike. Sam staggered, his eyes wide, his mouth opening but no words coming out. Blood bloomed across his shirt, dark and spreading fast. His body crumpled to the ground behind the counter. For a second, everything went silent. Earl was breathing hard, his arms still extended, the gun smoking in his hand. His eyes flicked to Darius, his expression unreadable. Darius felt his stomach drop. No. This wasn't supposed to happen. His feet moved before his brain caught up. He rushed to the counter, dropping to his knees beside Sam. The kid's breaths came shallow, uneven. His chest hitched, his fingers twitching against the floor. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Hey, stay with me," Darius whispered, his own voice shaking. "You're gonna be okay, man." Sam's eyes locked onto his, terrified, desperate. And then, nothing. His chest stopped moving, his fingers stilled, dead. The world spun around Darius. His ears rang. "D, let's go." Earl's voice snapped him back. Darius looked down at the boy, at the life stolen in a single breath. His hands shook, his stomach twisted. "Darius, now!" Earl grabbed his arm, yanking him back to his feet. Darius stumbled, his breath coming too fast, his vision tunneling. The alarm was still blaring. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Everything inside him screamed to stop, to fix this, to undo what had just happened. But it was too late. So he ran. The cold, metallic snap of handcuffs locked around Darius Holloway's wrists, biting into his skin like steel fangs. The flashing lights of the squad cars painted the night in red and blue, their rhythmic pulses illuminating the stunned faces of onlookers gathered along Jefferson Boulevard. Darius didn't fight, didn't run, didn't say a word. He just stood there, hands bound, head lowered, as the officers shoved him into the back of the cruiser. The door slammed shut with a finality that rattled through his bones. His heart pounded, but not from fear. No, that had burned away the moment he saw Sam Carter's lifeless eyes staring back at him from that convenience store floor. This was something else, something heavier. The drive to Ravenhill Detention Center was long and silent, save for the occasional crackle of the police radio. The two officers in the front didn't speak to him, and he didn't expect them to. He wasn't a man anymore, not to them. He was a case number, a headline, another criminal being delivered to the system. When they reached the jail, the processing felt like an out-of-body experience. He was stripped of his clothes, forced into a gray jumpsuit that smelled of bleach and sweat, fingerprinted, photographed. Every movement was mechanical, cold. Finally, they led him to a dimly lit holding cell, the door clanging shut behind him with a finality that sent a shudder through his spine. Hours passed, maybe days. Time had lost its meaning. The only thing that mattered was the weight of what he had done. Then came the trial. The courtroom was suffocating, packed with strangers, faces he didn't know, but who all seemed to know him. The air was thick with whispers, judgment clinging to him like a second skin. He could feel their stares, their hatred. At the front of the room, the judge sat perched behind his high wooden bench, his eyes void of sympathy. Judge Robert Calloway, a man known for his merciless sentences, adjusted his glasses as the prosecutor rose to his feet. "Your Honor," the man began, voice steady, sharp, "the state intends to prove beyond any doubt that Darius Holloway, along with his accomplice, Earl Mackenzie, committed the cold-blooded murder of an innocent young man." Murder. The word hit Darius like a hammer to the chest. He wanted to say it wasn't supposed to happen, that he never meant for Sam to die, that Earl was the one who pulled the trigger. But none of that mattered. Sam was dead, and Darius had been there. The evidence was damning. The surveillance footage, grainy but clear enough, showed him standing there, the gun in his hand, the cashier's blood pooling on the floor. The jury barely looked at him as witness after witness was called. Then came Margaret Carter, Sam's mother, a woman whose grief had carved lines deep into her face, making her look years older than she was. She took the stand, her hands gripping the railing so tightly her knuckles turned white. "I lost my son that night," she said, her voice trembling but strong. "He was 19. She turned her gaze to Darius, and for the first time since the trial began, he forced himself to look at her. He had dreams, a future, and you took that from him. Darius swallowed hard, his throat burning. Margaret exhaled shakily, then wiped a tear from her cheek. "I wake up every morning, and for a split second I forget. I forget that he's gone, and then I remember, and it breaks me all over again." The courtroom was silent, heavy with something deeper than anger, something that sat between grief and justice. Then it was time for the defense. His lawyer, James Whitmore, a weary public defender who had probably lost more cases than he had won, did what he could. Mr. Holloway did not fire the fatal shot, Whitmore argued. This was an act of desperation, not premeditation. But the jury wasn't interested in desperation. They were interested in punishment. It took less than an hour for them to return. When the foreman stood reading from the small slip of paper in his hands, the words, "guilty of first-degree murder," felt like lead in Darius's chest. Then came the sentence. The judge's voice was calm, emotionless. "The court hereby sentences you to death by electrocution." The gavel struck, and just like that, his fate was sealed. Darius didn't react, didn't flinch, because in a way, he had already died the night Sam did. The walls of Ravenhill State Penitentiary were thick, gray, and lifeless. They swallowed time, erased seasons, turned years into nothing but numbers scratched into concrete. Darius Holloway had been here for months now, maybe years. He wasn't sure anymore. The days bled into each other, one after the next, like water dripping from a leaky faucet, slow, relentless. His cell was 6 feet wide, 10 feet long, a metal bed bolted to the wall, a thin mattress that did nothing for his back, a toilet in the corner with no seat. There was a window, if you could call it that, a slit in the wall barely wide enough for the sunlight to creep through. But it wasn't the walls that made this place feel like hell. It was the voices of men waiting to die. At night, the screams would start. Some came from the cells nearby, raw and desperate, others from the execution chamber down the hall, where the air smelled like burnt metal and final prayers. "Please, don't do this, please!" Darius would press his hands against his ears, squeezing his eyes shut. It didn't help. Nothing did. The sound of death seeped into the cracks of this place, filling every empty space. "You hear that?" The voice came from the next cell over. "Luis Ramirez. Darius had met him on his first day in Block C, the section of the prison reserved for the men who had run out of second chances. Luis was in his 50s, his skin weathered like an old book, tattoos climbing up his arms like vines. He had been on death row for over a decade, his sentence postponed more times than he could count. Now he sat against the wall, smoking a cigarette he had probably traded half his dinner for. "That sound," Luis continued, exhaling a slow stream of smoke, "that's what waits for us, hermano." Darius stared at the ceiling, his hands still balled into fists. "I don't need the reminder," Luis chuckled. "Doesn't matter if you need it, ain't like it's going anywhere." Silence stretched between them, thick and unmovable. Then Luis spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "How long they give you?" Darius let out a slow breath. 4 months. Luis nodded, tapping ash from his cigarette onto the cold floor. "Guess that makes you lucky." Darius frowned. "How the hell am I lucky?" Luis smirked. "You don't gotta rot here as long as the rest of us." Darius didn't answer. There was nothing to say. Time passed differently on death row. Some days moved like molasses, others vanished in the blink of an eye. The guards treated them like ghosts, already gone, just waiting for their bodies to catch up. Meals were slid through metal slots. Showers were 10 minutes, chained and watched. Exercise was in a concrete pit with a chain-link ceiling, like a cage inside another cage. And then there was the countdown. The quiet ticking in the back of his mind. 4 months, 3 months, 8 weeks, 30 days. Every time he blinked, the number got smaller. One night, when sleep wouldn't come, he sat up in his bunk, staring at the shadows stretching across the floor. His mind wandered, like it always did, back to Sam Carter. His face, his voice, the way his hands had trembled, the way his breath had hitched in his chest before it stopped altogether. Darius ran a hand down his face, breathing deep. There was no escaping it, no way to outrun the past in a place like this. "You pray?" The question came from Luis, his voice thick with exhaustion. Darius scoffed, shaking his head. "Ain't no point." Luis hummed, amused. "You sure?" Darius looked at him through the bars, brow furrowed. "You think God listens to men like us?" Luis took another drag, let the smoke curl from his lips. "I think, when you get close enough to the end, you start asking different questions." Darius didn't answer, didn't need to, because deep down, he already knew Luis was right. The air in Ravenhill State Penitentiary was stale, thick with the scent of sweat, rust, and something deeper, something that clung to the walls, soaked into the floors. It was the smell of hopelessness. Darius Holloway had grown used to it. Days passed in slow, heavy silence. The only sounds were the occasional distant shouts of prisoners, the rattling of metal trays, and the buzz of fluorescent lights that never truly went dark. And then, one afternoon, something changed. Darius sat on the edge of his cot, elbows resting on his knees, staring at the cracked concrete floor. He heard the shuffle of footsteps, the low murmur of a guard speaking. "Got a visitor for you, Holloway." Darius didn't look up. He hadn't had a visitor in years. The last time someone came, it had been his mother. She had sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap, her lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't cry, didn't scream, just looked at him like she was searching for something in his face. By the time she left, she hadn't found it. He had assumed that was the last time he would see anyone from the outside. But now, someone was here. A guard unlocked his cell. "Let's go." Darius stood, his body moving on autopilot. His shackles clanked as the guard cuffed his wrists and led him down the dimly lit hallway. The visitation room was small, lined with scratched plexiglass windows, the kind that kept people separated, even when they were face to face. He stepped inside, his eyes narrowing as they landed on the man sitting across from the divider. He wasn't family, wasn't a lawyer, wasn't anyone Darius had ever met before. The man was old, maybe late 60s, with dark skin and silver-streaked hair. His face was lined, but not from time, from wisdom, from experience, from seeing too much. He wore a plain button-up shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing a simple leather wristwatch. And on his lap sat a weathered Bible, its edges frayed from years of use. Darius exhaled through his nose. "You a preacher?" The man smiled, slow and knowing. "Pastor Benjamin Reed," he said, his voice deep and warm, like the kind of voice you trusted before you even knew why. Darius let out a dry laugh, shaking his head. "They send you in here to save me?" Benjamin didn't flinch. "I ain't here to save nobody, son." Darius leaned back against the chair, shackles rattling against the table. "Then what are you here for?" Benjamin studied him for a moment, then placed his hands over his Bible. "To tell you the truth." Darius arched a brow. "And what truth is that?" Benjamin exhaled, his fingers tracing the worn leather of the book. "That you ain't as lost as you think you are." Darius scoffed, shaking his head. "You ever read my file, Pastor? 'Cause I sure as hell feel lost." Benjamin's gaze didn't waver. "I know what you did." Darius tensed. "I know about Sam Carter," Benjamin continued. "I know about that night in that store." Darius swallowed hard, but didn't speak. "I know you stood there and watched that boy take his last breath." Darius's jaw clenched. "And?" Benjamin tilted his head slightly. "And I also know it's been eating you alive ever since." The words hit hard. Darius shifted in his seat, looking away. "You don't know nothing about me. I know enough." Silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Darius's fingers twitched. He wanted to get up, walk out, end this conversation before it dug deeper into the places he had spent years trying to bury. But something held him there. Something in the way Benjamin looked at him, like he wasn't just another lost soul, another dead man walking, like he was still worth something. "You ever think about what happens after this?" Benjamin asked, tapping a finger against the table. Darius smirked, though there was no humor behind it. "After what?" Benjamin didn't blink. "After they strap you to that chair." Darius exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Ain't got much choice in that, do I?" Benjamin's voice softened. "You got a choice in what happens after." Darius ran a hand over his face, letting out a bitter laugh. "You really think there's a place for a man like me after this?" Benjamin leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "I think redemption ain't about where you've been. It's about where you choose to go from here." Darius didn't speak, didn't move. The past was too heavy, too deep. For years, he had convinced himself that there was nothing left for him beyond these walls, that once they flicked that switch, that would be it. But now, sitting across from this man with his quiet confidence, his unwavering belief, Darius felt something stir in his chest. Something small, something dangerous, hope, and he didn't know what to do with it. The days in Ravenhill State Penitentiary passed like slow drips from a leaking faucet, each one the same. Each one dragging Darius Holloway closer to the inevitable. He had stopped counting how many nights had passed since Pastor Benjamin Reed first sat across from him, speaking of redemption like it was something real, like it was something he could actually grasp. Darius didn't believe in things he couldn't see, and he sure as hell didn't believe in forgiveness. Not for men like him, not after what he had done. The guard came to his cell early in the afternoon, keys jingling at his side. "Holloway," he called, voice gruff. "You got another visitor." Darius frowned, pushing himself up from his cot. "Pastor again?" The guard shook his head. "Nope, somebody else." Darius felt his stomach tighten. Nobody else ever came. The walk to the visitation room was the same as always. Long, sterile hallways, the echoes of footsteps bouncing off the concrete walls. The closer he got, the heavier his chest felt, like someone had stacked bricks on top of his ribs. Then he stepped inside and saw her. Margaret Carter, his lungs locked up. She was sitting there, small and stiff, her hands resting on the table in front of her. Her skin was pale, stretched too tight over her face like grief had hollowed her out from the inside. Her hair, once dark, had given way to streaks of gray. She looked tired, not just physically, but the kind of tired that never leaves a person. Darius felt his legs turn to stone. He had pictured this moment before, had imagined it 100 different ways. Somewhere deep down he had expected her to come, expected the hatred that would be in her eyes, the venom, the fire. But there was none of that, only emptiness. The guard nudged him forward. Darius sat. For a moment neither of them spoke. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until Margaret exhaled sharply. "Do you know why I'm here?" Darius swallowed hard. His voice felt stuck, like he had forgotten how to use it. "No." Margaret's fingers tightened around each other. "I don't either." That surprised him. She let out a slow breath. "For years, I thought about what I'd say to you if I ever sat across from you like this. I imagined screaming. I imagined hating you so much it would burn through my skin." Darius didn't move, didn't even breathe. Margaret's voice wavered, but she kept going. "But I don't hate you, Darius." His hands curled into fists beneath the table. "You should. Her jaw tensed. Maybe. Another long pause. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out something that made his entire world tilt. A photograph. She placed it on the table between them, sliding it toward him with slow, deliberate movements. Darius didn't want to look, didn't want to see what he had stolen. But his eyes betrayed him, and when they landed on the picture, his chest tightened like a vice. It was Sam, smiling, alive. A grainy photo, slightly bent at the edges, of a boy standing in front of a car, arms crossed, the sun catching his face just right. He looked young, too young. Darius's throat burned. Margaret cleared her throat, her gaze never leaving his face. That was taken 2 weeks before you killed him. The words hit like a hammer. Darius clenched his jaw, forcing himself to meet her eyes. I wake up every morning, she said, voice barely above a whisper, and for a few seconds I forget. I forget that my son is gone, and then it comes back. The weight of it, the finality of it. Darius's nails dug into his palms. I'm sorry, he whispered. Margaret's lips pressed together like she was holding something back. I know. Another silence. This one different. Darius let out a shaky breath. I don't deserve forgiveness. Margaret's eyes darkened. No, you don't. He nodded, jaw tight. But she continued, and this time her voice cracked. Neither do I. Darius frowned, confusion flickering across his face. Margaret's hands trembled as she pressed them together. Do you know how much anger I've carried? How much bitterness? Do you know how many nights I've sat awake thinking about the fact that I'll never hear my son laugh again? Darius swallowed. She shook her head. That hatred, it's been eating me alive, and I can't do it anymore. Darius's breath stilled. Margaret exhaled. I'm not here to tell you that I forgive you. I don't know if I ever will. Darius felt his stomach sink. But I don't want to hate you anymore, she whispered. Because hating you, it won't bring Sam back. Darius stared at her, unable to speak. Margaret blinked rapidly, as if holding back tears. I don't know if you believe in God, she said softly, but I do. And he says vengeance isn't mine to take. Darius closed his eyes for a moment, his whole body tense. When he opened them, Margaret was standing. She slid the photo back into her bag, then looked at him one last time. I don't know if I'll come back, she admitted. But I needed to see you, needed to say this. Darius nodded slowly, his throat too tight to form words. She stepped toward the door, her fingers brushing against the metal handle. Then, without turning around, she said, I hope you find peace before the end. And then she was gone. The world outside Ravenhill State Penitentiary had already moved on. The city's streets were filled with the usual hum of life, people going to work, lights flickering in diners, voices rising and falling in the night air. But inside these walls, in the farthest wing of death row, time had already stopped. Darius Holloway sat on the edge of his cot, his elbows resting on his knees, fingers laced together. He stared at the small slit of a window near the ceiling, the only thing in his cell that reminded him the sky was still there. Tomorrow he would die. The thought didn't shake him as much as it should have, maybe because a part of him had already died long ago. The guard had slid his last meal through the slot an hour ago. Fried chicken, mashed potatoes, cornbread. He barely touched it. What was the point? His hands trembled slightly as he exhaled, rubbing his palms together. The cell was quiet, too quiet. Then, the sound of footsteps. Darius didn't have to look up to know who it was. The clinking of keys, the heavy sigh of someone who had seen too much. Pastor, Darius muttered, his voice rough. Benjamin Reed stepped closer to the bars, his old eyes calm but sharp. He still wore that same weathered hat, the brim bent just enough to show its years. Mind if I sit? The pastor asked. Darius shrugged. Ain't like I can stop you. Benjamin pulled a stool from the hallway and settled in, resting his arms on his knees. He didn't speak right away. Darius let the silence stretch, his eyes fixed on the shadows dancing across the walls. Finally, Benjamin leaned forward. How you feelin'? Darius let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh, like a man who's got 24 hours left. Benjamin nodded as if he understood more than he should. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out something small. A Bible, edges frayed, pages worn thin from years of fingers flipping through them. He slid it through the bars. Darius stared at it for a long moment. What am I supposed to do with that? Benjamin's voice was quiet but firm. Read it. Darius scoffed, shaking his head. Ain't no point. There's always a point, Benjamin countered. Darius ran a hand down his face, feeling the weight of the day pressing against his bones. Look, I get it. You want me to say some prayer, get right with God before they fry me. But it don't work like that. Benjamin tilted his head slightly. And why's that? Darius's jaw tightened. Because people like me don't get forgiven. The pastor studied him for a long, quiet moment. Then he asked, "Who told you that?" Darius let out a slow breath. "Ain't nobody gotta tell me. I know what I done. I know who I am." Benjamin nodded. "Yeah, you do." He tapped the Bible. "But do you know who he is?" Darius didn't answer. The pastor leaned closer, his voice softer now. "I ain't here to force you into anything, Darius. Ain't how faith works. But I am here to tell you the truth. And the truth is, you ain't beyond grace. You ain't beyond mercy." Darius clenched his fists. "You don't know that." Benjamin's eyes darkened. "I do." He pointed a finger at his chest. "I know it because I wasn't always a man with a Bible in his hand. I know it because I was a man who did some things he ain't proud of. And I know it because I found out the hard way that the only thing heavier than guilt is carrying it alone." Darius swallowed hard. Benjamin's voice softened. "You think you gotta die like this, son? With that weight still sitting on your chest?" Darius looked away. He wanted to tell the pastor he was wrong. He wanted to tell him he didn't need saving, but something inside him cracked. Because the truth was, he didn't want to die like this. Not with the guilt, not with the fear, not with the last thing he saw in this life being the memory of Sam Carter's eyes fading to nothing. His breath hitched, his fingers twitched. Slowly, his hand moved toward the Bible. His fingertips brushed against the cover. Benjamin nodded. "Ain't gotta be a fancy prayer. Ain't gotta be perfect. Just gotta be real." Darius closed his eyes. For the first time in decades, he prayed. Not for an escape, not for a miracle, just for mercy. The morning came too fast. Darius Holloway lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling, his fingers lightly brushing the worn leather cover of the Bible that still rested beside him. He hadn't slept. Not really. His mind had been too full. Memories, regrets, the weight of every choice that had led him here. He had prayed. For the first time in his life, he had prayed. Not for freedom, not for a way out, but for peace. Now, as dawn broke through the tiny slit of a window in his cell, he wondered if it would come. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Steady, measured. He exhaled. This was it. A key turned in the lock. The heavy steel door groaned open, and two guards stepped inside, their expressions carefully neutral. This wasn't their first time escorting a man to his death. It wouldn't be their last. One of them cleared his throat. "Holloway." Darius sat up slowly, his muscles stiff, his body heavier than it had ever felt before. He stood without resistance, extending his arms as they placed shackles around his wrists and ankles. The chains clinked with every movement, a cold reminder of the finality of what was about to happen. A priest stood in the hallway, murmuring a prayer under his breath. Darius barely heard him. His heartbeat was louder than any words. The walk to the execution chamber wasn't long, but it felt endless. The air in the corridor was thick, suffocating. Every step was measured, deliberate. Each footfall echoed off the concrete walls like a drumbeat counting down to the inevitable. One step, then another. Through the bars, prisoners watched in silence. Some stood, some sat on their bunks, eyes hollow, staring at a man they knew they would never see again. Darius didn't look at them. His eyes stayed forward, locked on the end of the hallway where a set of heavy steel doors waited for him. His last destination, a dead man walking. Inside the execution chamber, the air was sterile, colder than the rest of the prison. The chair sat in the center of the room, thick leather straps hanging from its arms, wires coiling around its base like snakes waiting to strike. Beyond the glass window, a small group of people had gathered. The warden, a doctor, a few officials, and her. Margaret Carter, the mother of the boy he had killed. Her face was unreadable, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes locked on his. Darius forced himself to meet her gaze. The guards guided him forward, lowering him into the chair. The leather straps tightened around his wrists, his chest, his ankles. The pressure was firm, unyielding. He inhaled slowly, exhaled. His pulse thundered in his ears. "Darius Holloway," the warden's voice broke through the quiet. "Do you have any final words?" Darius's mouth felt dry. He swallowed hard, then lifted his chin. For the first time in his life, he spoke without anger, without excuses. His voice was steady. "I was guilty the second I pulled that trigger," he said, his words cutting through the silence. "I spent years trying to pretend I wasn't, trying to tell myself I didn't deserve what was coming." He let out a slow breath. "But I do, and I accept it." He turned his gaze to Margaret. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Something flickered in her eyes. She didn't speak, didn't nod, but she didn't look away. Darius lowered his head, exhaling one last time. Then he whispered, just loud enough for the room to hear, "Jesus has set me free." The warden gave a slow nod. A switch was pulled. The air in the execution chamber was thick with silence, the kind that pressed against the skin, heavy and unshakable. Darius Holloway's body sat motionless in the chair, his wrists and ankles still bound by leather straps. The final words he had spoken, "Jesus has set me free," hung in the air, lingering like smoke after a fire. And then, the switch was pulled. A sharp, crackling sound filled the room as electricity surged through his body. His muscles tensed, his fingers curled, his chest heaved against the restraints. The smell of burning filled the air, an acrid, inescapable scent. Behind the thick glass window, the witnesses watched, some without expression, some with quiet unease, others with something colder, satisfaction. Margaret Carter sat among them, her fingers interlocked, gripping her hands so tightly her knuckles had turned white. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. She had told herself she would watch this, that she needed to watch this. And yet, as she stared at the man who had taken her son from her, she didn't feel what she had expected to feel. Not relief, not closure, just an overwhelming, aching emptiness. Darius Holloway had died, but Sam Carter was still gone. Nothing had changed. The newspapers ran their stories the next morning. Darius Holloway, convicted murderer, executed by electric chair. Some columns were cold and factual. Others painted him as a monster. Some mentioned his final words, questioning whether they were genuine or just a desperate man's last attempt at redemption. But those were just headlines. Outside of Ravenhill's walls, the world moved on. The city kept breathing. People went to work, kids went to school. But inside, within the prisoners who had watched him take that last walk, within the guards who had escorted him, within the walls that had held him for so long, something lingered. A whisper. A story of a man who had entered this place one way and left it another. Pastor Benjamin Reed stood alone in his small church that night, the dim glow of candlelight flickering against the stained glass windows. He had seen many men die in his years walking the halls of death row, some cursing the world, some begging, some silent. But Darius Holloway had died differently. Benjamin knew what people would say, that Darius's final words meant nothing, that a lifetime of sin couldn't be undone in a few short weeks. But Benjamin also knew something they didn't. Grace didn't come with conditions. It wasn't about deserving it. It was about choosing it, and Darius had chosen. Benjamin exhaled slowly, then opened his Bible, his fingers brushing against the worn pages. Psalm 34:18. "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." A small, knowing smile touched his lips. Darius Holloway hadn't died a free man in the eyes of the world, but he had died free where it mattered most. Somewhere in the city, tucked between the cracks of Ravenhill's forgotten streets, someone had left behind a message, a simple white spray-painted phrase on a weathered brick wall, bold, unshaken. Freedom isn't living, it's being forgiven. And there you have it, a story of regret, redemption, and the power of one final choice. But now I want to ask you something. What would you do if you only had one day left to live? Would you carry your regrets to the grave? Or would you fight for peace, for forgiveness, for something greater than yourself? Darius Holloway didn't get a second chance in this life, but he found something even more powerful in his last moments. What about you? If there's one thing this story proves, it's that it's never too late to change. Never too late to make things right. Never too late to seek forgiveness or give it. So tell me in the comments, do you believe in redemption? Do you think people can truly change no matter what they've done? I want to hear your thoughts. And if this story moved you, if it made you think, then don't stop here. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss more stories like this. Stories that challenge, inspire, and make you see life differently. Thanks for watching, and remember, your story isn't over yet.